Consider the shape of the Roman legionary formation from above, not from the ground, where all you see is the back of the helmet in front of you and the press of shields around you, but from above, where the geometry of it becomes visible. 3 lines of soldiers staggered across the field in a checkerboard pattern, each unit precisely spaced, each successive line carrying more experience, more armor, more years of service than the one before it. It doesn't look like a mob. It looks like a mechanism, and that is exactly what it was. The Roman Manipular Legion was not simply a collection of men with weapons. It was a precision instrument, built over 2 centuries of war and reform, designed to do one specific thing with unmatched reliability: press forward, absorb punishment, and grind the enemy into submission through disciplined mass and accumulated force. This is where the story of Cannae actually begins, not with Hannibal, not with the Alps, and not with a date. It begins with understanding what Rome built, and what Rome built it to do. What happened on the plain of Cannae in the summer of 216 BC is usually told as a story about Hannibal's genius, and he was, without question, one of the most capable battlefield minds the ancient world produced. But that version of the story places almost all the weight on one man, and almost none on the system he was fighting against. Here is the part that is rarely told in full. Hannibal didn't win at Cannae by being stronger than Rome. He won by being the one person who understood the Roman military system clearly enough to design its specific inverse. The Roman army walked into the greatest single-day military catastrophe in its history because it did exactly what it had been trained to do. The forward push that had made Rome nearly invincible in almost every engagement it ever fought was, at Cannae, the mechanism of the trap. The better Rome fought, the deeper it went in. To understand how that works, you have to understand the machine first. The Roman Republic of the 3rd century BC had been at war, in one form or another, for as long as any living Roman could remember. What emerged from those generations of warfare was a military system unlike anything in the ancient world. It was called the Manipular Legion, and its defining characteristic was not brute strength, it was structured adaptability. The legion was divided into tactical blocks called maniples, each containing roughly 120 soldiers, arranged across the battlefield in that distinctive checkerboard pattern. The spacing between maniples was not empty space or a mistake. It was engineered flexibility. It allowed exhausted units to withdraw and fresh ones to fill the line, without the whole formation collapsing into confusion. It had broken the rigid Macedonian-style phalanx, which required uniform depth and uniform contact to maintain its wall of spears. The maniple system could fracture and reform, absorb pressure from multiple directions, and keep fighting when a phalanx would have disintegrated. The 3 lines each had a function. At the front, the hastati, the youngest men, in their late teens and early 20s, armed with heavy javelins called pila and the short stabbing sword, the gladius. Before close engagement, they hurled the pila toward the enemy line. A well-thrown pilum hit with enough force to punch through a shield, and its soft iron neck was designed to bend on impact, so it couldn't be pulled out or thrown back. 2 volleys of pila could disrupt any formation. Then the hastati drew their gladii and moved into close contact. Behind them, the principes, older men, more experienced, heavier equipped, waiting. If the hastati couldn't break the enemy line, they pulled back through the gaps in the formation, and the principes stepped forward. Behind the principes, the triarii, the oldest soldiers in the army, veterans who had seen everything, armed with long spears rather than swords, they were the final reserve. Roman soldiers had a saying about a situation that had grown catastrophic. It has come to the triarii, meaning, we have used everything else. This is the last thing we have. The genius of this system was that it traded the raw shock power of the phalanx for something more sustainable: sequential pressure. The enemy fought the hastati, then the principes, then the triarii, each line fresher than the previous one. Rome didn't need to overwhelm you immediately. Rome could afford to be patient, to feed the engagement in stages, to wear you down across time while keeping fresh troops in reserve. It was, in the most literal sense, a machine designed to apply force continuously and systematically until something gave way. And there was one instruction embedded at the heart of this system, one principle that governed almost every tactical decision a Roman soldier or commander made. When the enemy gives ground, press forward. When the line bends under your pressure, push more men in. Do not stop. Do not pull back. The momentum of the push is your weapon. The cohesion of the formation is your armor. Trust the system. Trust the training. That instruction was not arrogance, and it was not stupidity. In the vast majority of the battles Rome ever fought, it was completely correct. It had won Rome its dominance over the Italian peninsula, its victories in Sicily, its position as the most powerful state in the Western Mediterranean. The Roman soldier who pushed forward when the enemy yielded wasn't making an error. He was executing a doctrine that had been proven on hundreds of battlefields over 2 centuries. What he couldn't see from inside the formation, what no Roman soldier at Cannae could see, was that there was one specific configuration of the battlefield where that instruction was not just wrong, but catastrophically, perfectly, precisely wrong. That configuration was what Hannibal had spent weeks engineering. But before we get to the plain of Cannae, we have to go somewhere else first. Because Cannae was not the first time Hannibal had exploited this specific vulnerability. He had tested the mechanism twice before, on different terrain, against different Roman armies. And Rome had seen the pattern both times. The fact that Rome marched to Cannae anyway is not evidence of incompetence. It is evidence of something deeper, something embedded in what Rome was. In December of 218 BC, about 18 months before Cannae, Hannibal's army and a Roman force met near the Trebia River in northern Italy. It was winter. The Roman soldiers were woken before dawn and driven across the freezing river before they had eaten breakfast, into air cold enough that the Trebia was running with slush. They crossed under harassment, formed up on the far bank, wet and cold and hungry, and began to advance. The Roman infantry pushed forward in the center, doing exactly what Roman infantry was supposed to do, and then, from the concealment of the riverbank vegetation behind and to their sides, approximately 2,000 Carthaginian cavalry and infantry emerged and struck the Roman flanks. The formation that had been advancing with full confidence through the center was, simultaneously, being struck on both sides and from the rear. Roughly 30,000 Romans were killed or captured. 6 months later, in June of 217 BC, a Roman army under consul Gaius Flaminius was marching along the northern shore of Lake Trasimene in central Italy. It was a narrow path, the lake on one side, hills rising steeply on the other, fog heavy over the water. Hannibal had placed his entire army in the hills and behind the ridgeline, invisible in the mist. When the Roman column had fully entered the defile, with no room to form battle lines and no space to maneuver, Hannibal struck from above and from the flanks. The consul Flaminius was killed. The column, unable to advance, unable to withdraw, unable to form, was destroyed nearly in its entirety. Modern historians debate the precise figures, but ancient sources record losses somewhere in the range of 15,000 men, with many more captured. 2 battles, 2 entirely different terrains, 1 consistent mechanism. Find the conditions where the Roman push-forward instinct becomes a vulnerability, then exploit it. After Trasimene, Rome did something it rarely did. It acknowledged that direct engagement with Hannibal was not working and appointed a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus, with a specific mandate: do not fight. Fabius understood that Hannibal could be beaten on the battlefield in a direct engagement almost every time, because Hannibal understood Rome's system and had repeatedly demonstrated the ability to create conditions where that system failed. His strategy was attrition. Shadow Hannibal's movements through Italy, cut off his foraging parties, deny him the pitched battle he needed to demonstrate Roman vulnerability to its allies, and let the logistical reality of maintaining an army in hostile territory gradually wear the Carthaginian force down. It was working. For approximately a year, Rome avoided catastrophic losses, while Hannibal's supply situation became increasingly difficult. He couldn't be reinforced from Carthage. The Carthaginian Senate was inconsistent in its support, and Rome controlled the sea lanes. He was living off the Italian countryside, which was both politically counterproductive, burning Allied territory didn't encourage defection, and logistically unsustainable long-term. The problem was that the Fabian strategy was politically unbearable in Rome. Roman aristocratic culture had an equation built into it. Military aggression equaled civic virtue. The willingness to close with the enemy, to push forward, to fight rather than delay. These were not merely tactical choices. They were expressions of the Roman character, the Roman relationship to the Republic, the Roman identity. A man who delayed when he could have fought was not being cautious, he was being cowardly. The very word they eventually gave Fabius Cunctator, the delayer, began as an insult, not a compliment. Watching Hannibal burn the Italian countryside without response was experienced by most Romans not as strategic wisdom but as a humiliation that bordered on dereliction. By 216 BC, the political pressure had reached its limit. Fabius's dictatorship expired, and two new consuls were elected with a clear popular and senatorial mandate. Find Hannibal, assemble an army large enough to make the outcome mathematically impossible, and end this. The Senate authorized 8 legions for the campaign, a number that had never been done before in Roman history. Each legion was enlarged to 5,000 men from the standard 4,000, including Italian allied troops, who provided equal infantry strength and 3 times the cavalry of Roman citizen units. The total force assembled for the summer of 216 BC approached 80,000 infantry and approximately 6,000 cavalry. This army was not built out of arrogance. It was built out of logic. The reasoning was straightforward. Hannibal had won at Trebia and Trasimene because Rome had underestimated him, because the terrain had restricted Roman options, because the forces engaged had not been large enough. Fix all 3 problems simultaneously. Bring enough men that numbers alone decide the issue. Choose an open field where terrain cannot be exploited, and fight. The consuls elected to command this army were Lucius Aemilius Paulus, experienced, careful, considered sound by the Senate, and Gaius Terentius Varro, a more politically aggressive figure who had championed the aggressive engagement approach in the Senate. Ancient sources, particularly Livy, present Varro as reckless and Paulus as cautious, with the disaster at Cannae laid primarily at Varro's feet. That portrait deserves some skepticism. Livy was writing a century and a half after the fact. With clear sympathies toward the aristocratic tradition Varro did not represent. What seems truer to the historical picture is that both consuls were operating within a political system that had made one decision clearly: this army would not delay. It would find Hannibal, it would form its line, and the numbers would do the rest. That is the context in which Hannibal captured the Roman supply depot at Cannae. In the late summer heat of Apulia, Hannibal moved against a Roman storage facility at the town of Cannae on the Aufidus River. It held the grain and supplies being staged for the legions operating in the south. By taking it, he did not just deny Rome its provisions. He forced the Roman army to respond. An army of 80,000 men, consuming several tons of food a day, cannot tolerate losing its supply base. Varro and Paulus had to follow. Hannibal had chosen where the next battle would be fought, and he had chosen it carefully. The plain adjacent to the Aufidus was flat, open. No forests, no hills, no narrow passes, no lake shores. From the Roman perspective, this was the ideal ground, the very conditions that had been denied at Trebia and Trasimene. On flat ground, with 80,000 infantry against perhaps 40,000, the Roman plan was sound. Advance, push, break the center, win. There was nothing in the geography to prevent it. What Roman commanders did not fully calculate was what the flat plain meant for Hannibal's cavalry. His force included approximately 10,000 horsemen, Hasdrubal's heavy Hispanic Gallic cavalry on the left flank, and Mahabal's Numidian light horse on the right. Roman citizen cavalry numbered around 2,400. The allied cavalry on the Roman left brought the total to perhaps 6,000. Open ground was not just infantry country, it was cavalry country, and Hannibal had roughly twice the horsemen Rome could field. Hannibal also anchored his left flank against the river itself, the Aufidus, running behind his position. This was deliberate. The Roman army outnumbered his by a significant margin. On open ground, a larger army's natural response is to extend its flanks and attempt to overlap the smaller force. By placing his flank on the river, Hannibal eliminated that option. The Romans could not extend left. Whatever was going to happen would have to happen in the space between the river and the open country on his right. And then there was the wind. Livy records this directly, with the specificity of someone drawing on a reliable earlier source. Hannibal had positioned his camp so that the wind, a warm, dry, seasonal wind that the people of Apulia called the Volturnus, what we would today recognize as a variant of the Sirocco, blew at his back when the army formed for battle. The Volturnus rises in the morning and drives across the dried summer plains of Apulia in clouds of fine dust. Hannibal had learned its habits before choosing his ground. On the morning of August 2, when the two armies deployed facing each other across the plain, the Romans faced southeast. The wind was in their faces. Livy records its effect plainly. It drove clouds of dust into Roman eyes, and, according to Appian's account, the Romans simply could not see their enemies clearly. They fought half-blind, into dust and morning glare, against a force whose positions they could not fully resolve. This detail is sometimes dismissed as a minor atmospheric condition. It was not minor. In ancient warfare, where every tactical decision depended on visual intelligence of enemy positions and movements, fighting with obscured vision for hours was a serious degradation of combat effectiveness, and Hannibal had chosen it deliberately. But the wind was not the trap. The wind was a compounding condition. The trap was the formation. At the center of Hannibal's line, he placed his Iberian and Gallic infantry, his least reliable heavy infantry, in terms of disciplined formation holding, though far from contemptible fighters. He arranged them in a formation that bowed outward toward the Romans, a convex arc curving in the direction of the enemy line. At each end of this center, where the arc met the flanks, he positioned his African veterans, the Libyan and Phoenician heavy infantry, who had survived Trebia, Trasimene, and a dozen smaller engagements. These were among the most experienced soldiers in the ancient world, and they were equipped with something unusual: the weapons and armor stripped from Roman dead at the previous two battles. When they stood on the flanks of the Carthaginian line that morning, they were wearing Roman helmets, carrying Roman shields, holding Roman-style swords. They looked, from a distance, like Roman soldiers. Hannibal and his brother Mago took their positions personally in the center, among the Iberian and Gallic infantry. This detail matters. Ancient commanders did not typically stand with the units most likely to receive the heaviest pressure. That Hannibal placed himself there almost certainly means the center had specific orders that required his presence to enforce: absorb the Roman push, give ground, but give it deliberately, in order, without routing. Step back slowly and hold the formation together as the Roman mass pushes in. The African veterans on the flanks had different orders. They were to remain stationary, to wait. When the moment came, and they would know it when it came, they would wheel inward. On the Roman side, Varro and Paulus made their deployment choices based on the plan they had brought to Cannae: break through the center. To maximize the striking force of the infantry push, the Roman formation was deepened significantly beyond its standard arrangement. The standard three-line manipular formation had built-in flexibility and maneuver capacity. By deepening it, stacking more ranks behind the front elements, Varro concentrated the pushing force in the center at the cost of that flexibility. The formation became, in essence, a battering ram: dense, compressed, powerful in a straightforward push, and extremely difficult to redirect laterally once in motion. Roman citizen cavalry took position on the right flank, nearest the river, where they would face Hasdrubal's heavy cavalry. Allied cavalry went on the left, where they would face Mahabal's Numidians. The hope was that both cavalry forces would hold their flanks long enough for the infantry to accomplish its mission. They didn't need to win the cavalry engagement. They needed to delay it. It was a plan that would have worked against almost any other formation in the ancient world. The morning of August 2, 216 BC, was hot. It was Apulia in early August, which means temperatures that modern visitors to the region find oppressive even without iron armor and a wooden shield to carry. The armies formed across the plain from each other, separated by perhaps a quarter-mile, in the building morning heat. The Volturnus wind had already risen. Fine dust from the sun-hardened plain moved across the field. The Roman soldiers looked southeast at the Carthaginian line and saw, at its center, what appeared to be a forward bulging arc of infantry, a center pushed out toward them, closer than the flanks, waiting to receive the Roman push. To a Roman soldier trained in the manipular doctrine, this was a promising sight. An enemy center that stood forward meant the enemy expected to win in the center. Rome planned to push it back. With 80,000 men pressing on 40,000, with every soldier following his training, the numbers should decide it. They did, just not in the way Rome expected. The battle opened with skirmishing light infantry and missile troops from both sides trading fire across the plain while the main formations advanced. Then the lines closed. On the Roman right, Hasdrubal's Hispanic and Gallic heavy cavalry hit the Roman citizen cavalry with what Polybius describes, with his characteristic precision, as a collision he calls authentically barbaric. No maneuvering, no feints, no attempt at elegant cavalry tactics. He pulled his men up. He reformed the formation while the Roman cavalry scattered across the plain, and then he turned not after the retreating Romans, but in the direction of the battle's center, toward the back of the Roman infantry mass. This single act of discipline was one of the most consequential cavalry decisions in ancient warfare. The pursuit would have been satisfying and militarily meaningless. Stopping holding the victory, reforming, redirecting was what made everything else possible. Meanwhile, the Roman infantry had reached the Iberian and Gallic center. The pilum volley went in, shields came up, and then the formations made contact. The Roman hastati pressed forward, the Carthaginian center pressed back, and then began to give ground. To the Roman soldiers at the front, this registered as success. The enemy line is bending. Push harder. Feed more men forward. The reserve lines behind the hastati pressed in, adding their weight to the forward momentum. The Principes moved up to reinforce the contact. More pressure, more push. The Carthaginian center continued to step back, one rank at a time, in a retreat that was ragged but did not break controlled, though it didn't look entirely controlled to the Romans pressing against it. What the Romans couldn't see from inside their formation was what this looked like from above. The Carthaginian center, which had started as a convex arc bulging toward them, was now inverting. The arc was curving backward, away from the Roman push, and as it curved, the Roman mass was moving forward into the space it created. The Roman formation was entering a bowl. The sides of the bowl, the African veterans on the Carthaginian flanks, were still not engaged. They stood at the edges of the deepening curve, facing inward, watching the Roman mass move deeper. Every Roman soldier, doing exactly what his training required, was pushing his entire army further into the trap. On the Roman left, the allied cavalry, under the Numidians' pressure, had been locked in a standoff. Hannibal's light horse was not trying to immediately break the Roman allied cavalry. Their role was to hold it in place, to prevent it from being used elsewhere, to keep it occupied. It had worked, but the allied cavalry was pinned. Now Hasdrubal's reformed force arrived behind them. The Roman allied cavalry, still engaged with Hannibal's Numidians to their front, suddenly found heavy Hispanic Gallic cavalry pressing in from behind. Caught between two forces, with no avenue of retreat, the allied cavalry broke. Consul Varro, commanding on this flank, fled with approximately 70 horsemen. The Roman cavalry presence at Cannae, on both flanks, was now gone. The African infantry began to wheel. Both flanking columns, the veterans who had waited through the entire opening phase of the battle, standing still while the storm of the center raged around them, began to pivot inward, 90 degrees, pressing toward the sides of the Roman infantry mass that had pushed so far into the bowl. And from the rear, Hasdrubal's cavalry was closing. There was no Roman response. Not because Roman soldiers lacked courage, they were among the most disciplined infantry in the ancient world, and the accounts of what followed make it clear they fought to the end. But the manipular system had no doctrine for lateral movement under pressure, the training that prevented panic, that kept soldiers in formation and facing forward and pressing into the enemy, had no protocol for stop, turn 90 degrees, and fight a completely different enemy on your flank while still engaged in front. The Roman formation was a machine designed for one direction. It had no reverse. The encirclement closed on all four sides. What followed is described in ancient sources with a specific and terrible precision that modern historians have returned to repeatedly. Polybius records that congestion prevented effective resistance. As the encirclement tightened and the space inside it shrank, the Roman mass compressed. Men were pressed together at the shoulders, front and back, unable to move in any direction. Thousands of plumed helmets and raised shields created a ceiling that blocked sight lines. Men in the interior of the formation could not see what was happening at the edges. They could barely see the man in front of them. The gladius, the short, deadly, close-quarters sword that was the Roman legionary's most personal weapon, required room to use. A thrust with the gladius needed the soldier to extend his arm, to lean into the blow, to create the space between his body and the enemy's body that the point needed to travel. At maximum compression, that space did not exist. The weapon that embodied Roman infantry excellence became, in the specific physical conditions Hannibal had created, an inert piece of iron pressed against a leg or a hip. Many Roman soldiers at Cannae were killed while still holding their swords undrawn. From outside the compressed mass, Carthaginian missile troops, Balearic slingers, light spearmen rained projectiles into a target that could not maneuver. Unlike a fluid battle where trajectories are unpredictable and targets are moving, this was a stationary, enclosed human mass standing in one place. The accuracy required was minimal. Wounded men fell and tripped those standing beside them. The fallen created obstacles, disrupting what little coherence the compressed formation still maintained. Livy wrote of conditions in which this was not a battle, not a rout, but sheer massacre. That phrase from a man writing more than a century after the event, drawing on sources much closer to it, carries the weight of testimony, not rhetoric. It describes, with clinical precision, what the trap had produced, a situation beyond the vocabulary of ordinary military catastrophe. The killing continued for hours. Consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus was killed on the battlefield. Ancient sources, including Livy, describe him refusing to flee, dying from wounds among his soldiers. Of the 40 military tribunes, the senior officers who commanded the legion's administrative and tactical functions, approximately 28, were killed. Ancient sources record roughly 80 men of senatorial or magistrate rank among the dead. Approximately 200 equestrians, the knights, the second tier of Roman aristocracy, died at Cannae. The historian Adrian Goldsworthy has compared the Roman death toll at Cannae to the casualties sustained by the British Army on the first day of the Somme offensive in 1,916 inches. His assessment, a comparable scale of loss compressed into a comparable window of time. Gregory Daly, in his detailed study of the battle, offers another comparison. More Romans and Italians were killed at Cannae in a single afternoon than Americans killed in combat throughout the entire duration of the Vietnam War. Both comparisons exist in named scholarly works, not as rhetorical flourish, but as genuine attempts to make a number comprehensible to a modern reader. Modern historians debate the precise casualty figures. Polybius records approximately 70,000 Roman dead. Livy's account gives a somewhat smaller number, closer to 50,000, with an additional 20,000 captured. The precise total is uncertain and has been debated by scholars including Goldsworthy and Daly themselves. What is not uncertain is the scale. Britannica estimates that approximately 20% of all Roman male citizens between the ages of 18 and 50 were killed that day. 1 in 5. The largest army Rome had ever assembled had been, in a single afternoon, functionally destroyed. Of approximately 80,000 men who had formed their lines that morning, around 14,000 survived, most of them from the tests of 2 Roman camps rather than the battlefield itself. The consul, who had fled with 70 cavalry, rallied some survivors at the nearby town of Canusium. The survivors of the greatest Roman army ever raised gathered in a foreign town and tried to account for what had happened. In Carthage, when the news arrived, there was reportedly celebration in the streets. Hannibal's cavalry commander, Hannibal, came to him after the battle, and Livy records what followed with the sharpness of a story too good for an ancient writer to leave alone. Hannibal urged Hannibal to march on Rome immediately. He promised that if Hannibal would follow with the infantry, Hannibal could be at Rome's gates with the cavalry in 5 days, and Hannibal would be dining victorious on the Capitoline Hill before the Romans knew he was coming. Hannibal declined. Livy records Hannibal's response. "Assuredly, no one man has been blessed with all God's gifts. You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but you do not know how to use one." Whether Hannibal actually said this, in those words, is something no historian can verify. Livy was writing approximately 2 centuries after the fact, with access to earlier sources whose reliability varied. The exchange has the ring of a literary construction, the kind of compressed, vivid dialogue that ancient historians use to crystallize a historical debate into a human moment. Treat it as a reported anecdote, not a transcript. The debate it encapsulates, though, was real. Should Hannibal have marched on Rome? Most modern military historians, examining the practical questions, have concluded that the march was almost certainly impractical. Rome was approximately 250 miles from the Cannae battlefield. The Carthaginian army was exhausted. It had taken significant casualties in the battle. Ancient sources record somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 Carthaginian dead. Hannibal had no siege equipment. The Alpine crossing had required him to abandon it for speed, and nothing had replaced it. Rome was not entirely defenseless. Livy's depiction of the city in complete panic should be read with the awareness that Livy was writing patriotic history, and the city had reserves that made a direct assault against its walls a different proposition than a field battle. And Hans Delbrück, the influential German military historian of the early 20th century, made a precise accounting. Cannae had destroyed 8 of Rome's 18 active legions. The other 10 were operational and deployable. The legions stationed in Sicily, Sardinia, and Spain had not been recalled. Hannibal's strategy had never been to conquer Rome in the conventional sense. He had not come to Italy to storm the Capitoline and plant a Carthaginian flag on the ruins. The treaty he later signed with Philip V of Macedonia in 215 BC is revealing about his actual intentions. Its language describes limiting Rome to its traditional domain around the Tiber, not destroying Rome. His war aim was dissolution, breaking the Roman alliance system that gave the Republic its manpower and reach. By demonstrating that Rome could not protect its allies, he expected those allies to recalculate their loyalties. In the weeks after Cannae, several Italian city-states, including Capua, Rome's second city, did defect to the Carthaginian side. The alliance showed cracks. It did not collapse. What Hannibal had not fully calculated was the specific nature of Roman institutional resilience. Not Rome the civilization, not Rome the culture, but Rome the political machine, its specific capacity to absorb catastrophe and convert it into organizational energy. The Roman Senate's response to Cannae is, in some ways, as remarkable as the battle itself. The 10 prisoner representatives who arrived in Rome after the battle, sent by Hannibal to negotiate ransom terms, appeared before the Senate and presented the Carthaginian offer. The Senate voted. The answer was no. Rome would not ransom its citizens, would not pay a single denarius under these conditions, would not negotiate with Hannibal from a position of recent catastrophe. The prisoners would have to be abandoned. This was not heartlessness, it was a calculated institutional signal to every Italian city watching. Rome does not bend under pressure. Whatever Hannibal has just done on the Apulian plain, it has not broken the Republic. Consul Varro returned to Rome. He had fled the battlefield with the remnants of the cavalry. He was not the man who had won at Cannae. By any conventional reckoning of ancient military accountability, he could have faced prosecution or disgrace. Instead, the Senate formally received him and expressed gratitude that he had not despaired of the Republic. 5 words that carried enormous institutional weight. The Senate was converting catastrophe into a narrative of resilience in real time, projecting stability and resolve to every wavering ally who was watching Rome for signs of collapse. Emergency measures followed. Slaves were recruited into the legions unprecedented in Roman history. Property qualification requirements for military service were suspended. The youngest and oldest men who had never served were called up. New armies were raised from the ruins of the old one. The Fabian strategy was quietly reinstated, not because Rome had finally accepted its wisdom, but because events had demonstrated its necessity. What Cannae revealed about Rome was not just a vulnerability, it revealed 2 things simultaneously: a specific tactical exploitability that a sufficiently perceptive opponent could design around, and an institutional architecture so robust that even the destruction of 20% of its fighting-age population could not force it to negotiate from weakness. The same cultural machinery that had driven Rome to Cannae, the refusal to accept limitation, the insistence on response, the incapacity for sustainable strategic patience, was also the machinery that kept it fighting for 14 more years until Hannibal was recalled to defend his homeland. The answer to Hannibal's formation did not come from abandoning the Roman military system. It came from a Roman commander who spent years studying what Hannibal had done at Cannae and asked a question that very few Roman generals had thought to ask. What would happen if someone used those same tactics against the man who invented them? That story belongs to a different battlefield, 14 years later, on the plains of North Africa, when Publius Cornelius Scipio, who had survived Cannae as a young officer and had spent the intervening years thinking about what he had witnessed, finally arranged the conditions to find out. But that is another video. What Cannae left behind was not only a changed war, it left behind a template. The double envelopment, the concave center, the closing flanks, the cavalry completing the encirclement from behind had been executed against the most sophisticated land warfare system in the ancient world, and had produced results that no one who studied military history could ignore. They haven't stopped studying it since. In the late 19th century, Field Marshal Alfred von Schlieffen became chief of the German General Staff at a moment when Germany faced the strategic problem of 2 potential enemies on 2 borders: France to the west, Russia to the east. Schlieffen became, by many accounts, obsessed with Cannae. He ordered the historical section of the General Staff to produce a series of studies which he titled, simply, Cannae, examining the double envelopment as the foundational principle of decisive battlefield victory. His conclusion was that the encirclement and annihilation of an enemy force, not merely defeating it, was the highest achievable military objective, and that Cannae was its purest historical expression. The Schlieffen Plan, Germany's strategic blueprint for the First World War, was explicitly modeled on this idea. While France attacked in the east, the bulk of German forces would sweep through neutral Belgium in a vast arc, enveloping the French army from its unguarded flank and rolling it up before Russia could mobilize. A continental-scale Cannae. The plan required the enemy to do what their doctrine demanded them to do, which is exactly what Hannibal's formation had required. Schlieffen's Cannae studies were eventually translated into English and published by the United States Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth in 1931, making them available to a generation of American officers preparing for a war they didn't yet know was coming. In 1940, Heinz Guderian conceptualized his armored divisions as the motorized equivalent of Hasdrubal's heavy cavalry, not the force that holds the line, but the force that sweeps around the outside and closes from behind. Erwin Rommel, campaigning across the North African desert, reportedly wrote the word Cannae in his diary when his forces successfully enveloped a British column. In the Gulf War of 1991, the left hook, of the coalition ground offensive. The wide flanking movement that swept around the Iraqi army's exposed western flank drew on the same tactical geometry that had stood over the Aufidus plain 200 years earlier. The reason Cannae is still taught at West Point is not because the double envelopment is a universal solution to military problems. It isn't. The Schlieffen plan failed. Cannae-style operations succeed under specific conditions and fail under others, and the history of military overconfidence in the Cannae model is long and instructive in its own right. The reason it is still studied is because the battle made visible something about military systems that has not changed. The same doctrine that makes an army reliable also makes it predictable. Reliability and predictability are the same property, seen from opposite directions. Rome's legionary system was not defeated by superior force. It was not defeated by treachery, not by overwhelming numbers, not by a failure of individual courage. It was defeated by a formation that had been specifically engineered to consume it through its own energy, to take the forward push that was Rome's most reliable weapon and redirect it into a closing space from which there was no escape. This is the version of Cannae worth understanding, not the version where one brilliant man on one side faces a mediocre opponent on the other. The version where an excellent system, a genuinely, historically successful, battle-proven system, meets the one opponent who understood it completely enough to design its inverse. The better the Roman soldiers fought, the more efficiently the trap closed. The discipline that kept them from breaking is exactly what kept them in the killing ground long enough to be killed. There is something in that specific kind of tragedy that military historians, and not only military historians, have never stopped finding worth thinking about. If you want to see how Rome eventually answered this, how the Republic produced a commander who had watched Cannae, studied what it meant, and built a formation that turned the method back on its creator, that story ends at Zama. It ends with Scipio Africanus standing on a North African plain, watching Hannibal arrange his troops in a formation Scipio had studied for 15 years, and understanding, finally, that he knew what came next.